Today is Friday, January 8th, 2016. My name is Elissa Kaplan, and this is Marianne Hoberman of Greenwich, Connecticut, originally of Stamford, Connecticut. And we are at the JCC in Stamford, Connecticut for the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. And it is our honor and our privilege to interview Marianne Hoberman. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So, Marianne, I'm going to ask you some questions about yourself and your family.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see, can you tell us when you were born?
I think I can. I was born on August 12, 1930 in the Stamford Hospital. And let's see, I'm the child of Milton Friedman and Dorothy Miller Friedman, Dora. And I'm not quite sure why we were here in Stamford at that time, because I was born here and shortly afterwards they moved. It was the Depression, and we lived in various places after that, primarily New Haven, where my mother's family lived. But we moved, I think we lived in Yonkers and the Bronx and New Jersey and wherever my father could get work. But we came back to Stamford when I was 5 years old, and I was brought up here, and I lived here till I went away to college. And I got married my senior year of college, so I never came back to live in Stamford. But in my own feelings, I'm from Stamford, and Stamford's my home, my
There you
original
go,
home.
and we're glad that you're back here today. Let me ask you about your grandparents. How did your family get to America?
Well, as far as I know, and again, I think we all talk about this, especially now, it seems to me, with roots and all of that kind of thing. In our family, the Jews, well, this is my mother's family mainly. We'll start with her family, the Millers. They didn't want to talk about where they came from. Remember, they got out because of pogroms and that kind of thing, and they came here, I guess, in the early part of the 20th century. And they, especially my mother she didn't even want my grandma, her mother, to talk about her childhood or anything. They had such bitter feelings, of course, about what had happened to the Jews. And so you were brought up not to be curious about your background, that America was the best place in the world, and we were, Americans were the best people, and we were Americans, and we were here. And so it was never anything even that I had any curiosity about. My dad's family, I think probably on his mother's side, they probably came over at about that time. But from what I know, and we've kind of gone into the history of it a little bit, but I don't really know. I think my father's family had been here. I think my father's father had been born here. But I don't know enough about it. It exists somewhere in the family memory. A lot of people are gone now, and I wish I knew a lot more, and maybe I'll try to learn more. But the feeling was that we were here in America now, and unlike my friend, well, at that time, I don't think anyone really talked that much about where they came from or whatever. But as years went by, the Irish were very interested in going back to trace their roots in Ireland, and the Italians, that kind of thing. My family and my people, no, not at all. We wouldn't have known where to go. Unlike many other Jewish families. And I don't remember that we had anybody that we knew of in the Holocaust or anything like that. I didn't hear anything about that, but now all the family was here.
Right. So your father's family got here probably in the 19th century.
Probably so, but as I say, I'm not entirely sure about that. There was a Midwestern kind of connection, but I don't really know.
Oh, okay, that could have been
Yeah.
German Jews. Okay.
Yeah, but I don't think so. The name Friedman sounds German Jewish, but it was never. My father did not speak Yiddish. His parents did, but spoke it, but they didn't speak it with each other the way my mother's whole family, everybody spoke Yiddish, and that was to keep the kids, so we didn't know what was going on. But, I mean, these are all very standard things that I'm sure you've heard before.
Well, but your story is your own special story. Did you learn how to speak Yiddish, or did you understand it when your grandparents?
Unfortunately, no. I longed to learn how to speak Yiddish. I loved my mother. I loved both my grandmothers. My grandfathers died when I was very little, so I didn't get to know them well at all. But I adored my grandmothers. They were very different. And so my mother's mother never learned to speak English well. And when we went to her apartment in New Haven, they'd sit around the kitchen table with their tea, with the cherry in the glasses, and they'd speak Yiddish, and I would sit there, and I was a very curious kid, but I wouldn't understand what they were saying, and I felt very akin to my grandma in that, because she didn't understand English very well, and I didn't understand Yiddish. So I picked up, we've all picked up different Yiddish expressions along the way and words, but no, and I really regret that, because when I went to graduate school many, many, many years later, it would have been nice to have, I could have worked on the Yiddish, had it at German as one of the languages, but no, I didn't have enough Yiddish.
To start from scratch. Were there any special foods that your grandmother cooked for you, or that you enjoyed with her?
What is the hard cookie? Mandel bread.
And did she make that for you?
Oh, did she ever? I still dunked it in the tea, and every time I'd come, it was in a little wooden cupboard in the kitchen, and there'd always be this big bowl of mandel bread for me. And what else did she make? She cooked a lot, and of course, but I don't remember any other particular things. Maybe kugel. But the mandel bread was the thing that I've always remembered. I wrote a poem about it. I really, it really was, and no one's ever made it like my grandma, They, very dry, very crunchy. And,
it's an art, not a science. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about your parents. Can you tell me a little bit about their names and where they came from and what they did?
Okay, so my dad is Milton, and he took on the middle name Gilbert for his father when his father died. Milton Friedman, 2 E's. And my mother is Dorothy Miller Friedman, and she was Dora. And they were very different, they were exactly the same age. They were both born in 1902. My dad was born here. My mother was actually born probably in Russia, but she came over when she was an infant. And so her dad had come over here, and I don't know whether it was because he was in service or something, but he became a citizen, and they could become citizens. But my mother never had a birth certificate or proof of her citizenship in some way. And I remember when I was a little girl, these are all kind of vague stories, but we went to Canada. We didn't travel a great deal. We had a lot of money at the beginning. We went to Canada when I was a little girl. My mother was terrified because she was afraid that they were going to ask her something. And but afterwards, they must have taken care of it because they did a lot of traveling. But, and she always said she was born, it was as if she was a tiny baby when she got over here. Let's see, my dad went to Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. I think he went there. We are now discovering that my dad told us different things, or we got different messages that weren't quite the same as we thought. But he had maybe a year of college, and it was prior to it must have been the 20s. We didn't have the Depression yet, but his father lost his money, and he didn't go back to college. My father longed to be a lawyer, and he would have made a marvelous lawyer. He really had the gift of gab, and he was, really told wonderful stories, very good on his feet, very smart. And that, I think, was always a disappointment to him, and that he hadn't had much schooling. And so he became a salesman, and he sold all kinds of things, as I told you before. And he also, but what he did mainly, he worked with a company called Investors Syndicate, and that was some kind of an insurance company, and it was based, I don't know what it was based, but there was an office in Stamford, and his, I don't know how he met his boss, a man named Terry Milligan, who was just a marvelous man, and gave my father, and in that time, I don't think there were many Jews in that business. And so after, when we settled in New Haven when I was about 3 years old, my dad would commute to Stamford and stay in the Roger Smith Hotel during the week and then come home each weekend.
So he drove.
So he drove to
So you
Stamford.
had a car.
We had a car. And we lived in New Haven in the bottom floor of a rented house with the Greenbergs who owned it. My mother, very bright, two girls, two boys that my grandma had with my grandpa, but he was quite a bit older than she was, I think, and had a first marriage, and the wife had died. So there were the half brothers scattered in New Haven, sisters in New Haven. Well, anyway, but my mother, she was one of these four. My mother did evidently very, very well in school, and all she wanted to do was be a teacher. And she could have gone to normal school, which they had then in New Haven, but the family, she couldn't go because they needed her salary. So when she was out of high school, she immediately went to work. Her brothers could go to college, right? But the girls couldn't. I mean, that was the story sort of then. So one brother didn't because he was a musician, and my Uncle Irving, and so I don't think he went to college, I'm not sure, but I think it was his choice not to go to college. My Uncle Phil, the youngest of the four, went through his doctorate at Yale as a townie and all on scholarship and that kind of thing. And, there's so many stories. But anyway, also, some of it's in my book, the novel that I wrote for children, Strawberry Hill. So a lot of the things they're kind of, tweaked a little bit, but there's a lot of autobiography in it as well.
What did your mother do when she worked?
I think she was a bookkeeper or something like that. She didn't, and she worked for a while because they didn't marry. I think they had me when she was 26. So that was kind of advanced for, I think she must have been that, some sort of office.
And how many siblings do you have?
I have Joel, isn't that enough? He's 2 years, 10 months younger than I am. He was born on June 16th, and I was born on August 12th, so there's almost 3 years between us.
I see. And winters were busy for your parents, I can see.
Oh, yeah.
Tell us about your education, especially your early education,
Right.
and then...
Yeah. Well, I went right through I went to pre-kindergarten and kindergarten in New Haven at the Roger Sherman School. And I learned subsequently that New Haven, that was very enlightened. They had this pre-kindergarten, and so you could go mornings and then afternoons. And I just remember my childhood. I mean, I made a career out of remembering my childhood and writing about it. And now nothing's very vivid in my mind, but up till fairly recently, extremely vivid in my mind. All kinds of things, and I have really very clear memories of my early childhood. And so I went to school there and just loved it. I remember we had our little pads or blankets, and we took naps, and we would, what else? I learned how to whistle in kindergarten. I remember that was one thing that I learned in kindergarten that made me very proud. And we lived with the Greenbergs, as I say, this beloved family who lived above us and owned our house. It was a block away from school. And then we moved, so my dad came home and announced that we were going to move to Stamford, that he found a house for us to rent. And that was when I was in kindergarten. And if you read the book, I was devastated. I did not want to move. I loved the Greenbergs. I loved the Greenbergs so much that my mother was very happy to get me away from the Greenbergs, because they had 3 boys and 2 girls, and I just worshipped them. They were older than I was. And So anyway, we came to Stamford and we got this house that we rented on Strawberry Hill Court, and it's not there anymore. You know, it was there till fairly recently, and then they, I think, torn the last ones down. And the Shermans, Joe and Gertrude Sherman, lived 2 doors down, and she was my mother's best friend. And next door to me lived Helene lived Martha, and what was her sister's name? Martha Hurley, her name was, and she was my best friend when I moved there. But when I heard it was very weird, when I heard we were moving to Strawberry Hill, and my dad told me that, all of a sudden everything changed. And I visualized this hill full of strawberries, and that we were going to move there, and everything was going to be marvelous. I was going to roll down the hill picking strawberries, and that was the seed for this novel that I wrote many years later. And we moved there, and it was a very nice. And we had a house of our own. I had a room of my own for the first time, and I went to Center School, and I don't know, a beautiful place, and what's been done to it is so sad. And if we could. I'm just pontificating, but that the world is so beautiful. Each morning when I wake up and I see that sunrise, and I think, where have I been all my life? It's been there every single morning, and I haven't even bothered to look at it most of the time. And it's more beautiful than anything in any museum, and grateful for my friends who sort of rallied around me with Norm's sickness and death, my kids, and I don't know, it's just all a great big mystery, and we're not going to solve it probably, so just enjoy the ride.
Thank you very much, Marianne Hoberman, for being part of the story and for telling us your truth.
Thank you. Called a dirty Jew in Stamford. I was called a dirty Jew by black kids. I was told that of course I could never respond in kind or anything. And all my little friends in that neighborhood, they weren't Jewish, but I was very aware that they came, certain families were very prejudiced. Others were not. My best friend when I was a little girl named Helene Bryant, who died of, God, what was it? Something that they now can cure when she was about 18. But and she was an only child, but her mother and dad, the Bryants, were just wonderful, wonderful people, and there was no thought of this kind of thing. But there were others, where you sensed very strongly that you were Jewish. And so I never went to Sunday school, was confirmed. There were no bat mitzvahs in those days.
Who taught those classes?
I went
what
to,
kinds of people taught those classes?
well, Mr. Hecht, you remember Abraham Hecht, who was a not very good teacher at the high school, but a nice man, and I remember he was one of my Sunday school teachers. I went to Girl Scouts at the temple, when it was over on Prospect Street. I worked at the Jewish Center. I was their librarian when I was in high school, such as it was. I'd sit in the library and check out books for them. I stole a Jane Austen collected, which I still have. So it was, but at the same time that I could feel ashamed of being Jewish, and which later on made me feel that I would always announce I was Jewish, the minute I walked into a room practically, in order to, At the same time, I loved being Jewish because I loved the warmth of, and again, particularly my grandma's family. I loved all these relatives. We had all these nutty relatives all around, and I always wanted to visit them, and in Brooklyn and in all those places. I was very curious about people and different. So it was a very mixed bag, and I didn't when I went to France for junior year, at first it was a revelation. I thought it was the first time that I wasn't a hyphenated American, I felt to myself. But that quickly, as you kind of get to the surface, you realize you're more hyphenated in France than you be anywhere else. And I certainly experienced different anti-Semitism in France when I was there. But it's so funny. I don't do much of anything anymore.
So did the boys?
The boys did not have bar mitzvahs because their dad said that, and they neither of them have regretted it. None of my children have claimed that they regretted that they didn't have a real Jewish education or any Jewish, except that my daughter, my older daughter, married a Chinese American boy and they had a son, and I think really to assert her, to kind of, because that's a very swallow-up culture. It's both the way the child looks but just the Chinese culture is just a very enveloping one and marvelous. So she, I think, had to fight back a little bit. So she joined, she lived in California, so she joined the temple out there. She had her son was bar mitzvahed. She was bat mitzvahed as an adult. So those are and now my younger son so none of them married Jews, or in the case of one of my sons, they hadn't married, but they lived together and had a child. None of these people were Jewish, but now we have Randy Rosenblum, because she's the second wife of my younger son, and she is just a marvelous young woman. And she doesn't know too much from Judaism either, but it is sort of interesting to have, another Jewish person in the family, so when we sit around. But in any case, that whole thing about Judaism, I think for so many Jews, we know, it's very fraught, and some people can kind of, like my brother, they've just gone on, all the kids have married. Well, no, Debbie has not married. Their older daughters, actually, both their daughters have married Jews, but they brought the kids up as Jews, and they've had them, bat mitzvah and all that kind of stuff.
I was going to say children rebel in strange ways.
Yeah. But this didn't even feel, with my kids, as I said, this son Chuck, who is now married to Randy, he was very interested in exploring all kinds of things, and so he became a Buddhist, and that was... but mostly they haven't seemed to have very strong religious, sort of.
The census is the Fairfield County Jewish Historical Society. Just wanted to know if you got married in Stanford?
Oh yeah, we got married at Temple. We got married at Temple Bethel.
Who was the rabbi then?
Rabbi Perlman, and yeah, that's right. You want to know about me as being Jewish too, but anyway.
Now you're telling me.
Right,
you're telling me.
Rabbi Perlman married us, and as I said, my dad was one of the founders of that temple, and I briefly joined Temple Bethel, I think after my mother died in Stanford, because I didn't like the rabbi, I don't remember where I was, but I loved the cantor, Yeah. And but again, I didn't stay with it because it just didn't fit in with my husband and the kind of life that I led.
Which brings me to my next question.
Yes.
Tell me about your career. Well, you've told us about your early career. Did you continue that? And did you also get involved in the community?
I started making up little poems and songs for my children when they were born, and I would, with no thought of being a children's writer. First of all, that wasn't, people didn't announce then, I am going to be a children's writer. I mean, it wasn't exactly a career choice. It would come to some people and they'd be marvelous, but, so anyway, and I was doing some freelance editing and proofreading for Little Brown, the publisher, who were then based in Boston. And so I got this idea for a children's book, and I asked Norm if he wanted to do some pictures for it, And he did. And then I spoke to the woman I worked for at Little Brown, and she gave me, she suggested I bring this or send this to the children's editor at the time, Ellen Jones, and I did. And so the first try, the first book, the first was accepted. So there was, I thought that's kind of the way it's done. I mean, you know, yeah, I was very, very lucky. And so, I was just kind of, that's how I started writing children's books. It was never an intention of mine. I always was going to write the great American novel, or I was going to be a great poet, and etc. But all those things, and I've come to terms with it. For a long time, I felt that this was second best kind of, and I always wanted to be doing something else. But I see now that probably I reached the level of my confidence. I didn't have to go above it, and this was what I was really suited to, the kind of ear I have, the kind of, and it's just been I've gotten all kinds of recognition and everything far beyond what I would have thought of or anything, and it in retrospect, certainly, even while I was doing it, to be able to, I never thought of going, again, of the generation, I never really considered, once I had all these children, of going out and getting a job out, even though I did it later on, I got some different jobs, but it was an awfully good way to raise a family and still have a career. It didn't support us very, that wouldn't have been possible. Later on, it would have been, and that got very satisfying too, that, it actually was remainship. But it really just gave me a wonderful focus, and again, a lot of what I did in the community involved going into schools and talking to children, being a writer in the schools, that kind of thing. I've done a lot of that sort of stuff over my life.
And were you involved in any community organizations?
Democratic Women's Club, Democrats above all. Greenwich Fair Housing, when they started, I was one of the early members of that. And then Literacy Volunteers, I worked with for many years off and on, both as a volunteer and then on their board. I'm not a great joiner. I mean, that's never been my thing, but
Right, exactly. So I was going to ask you what you do in your spare time, but I wonder if you have any.
Well, now I have almost too much. But the last 5 years, Norm was sick, and so I was taking care of him mainly. And now I'm trying to sort of get used to not having him anymore.
Are you writing?
I'm writing in my journal, but I'm not doing any writing, and I hope to, get back to it again. I do a lot of other things. I mean, I have a group of, there's an organization in Greenwich called At Home in Greenwich, and I think, do you have something like that in Stamford as well?
I wish we did.
Yeah, you ought to get it going. It's really, about that. So no, it started up in Beacon Hill in Boston, and it's all over the country now, and I don't think they're affiliated necessarily, but they're
Are you involved with that?
Yeah, I was one of the early members of it, not because I needed it then, but, it's to keep people in their homes, et cetera, et cetera. And, but I thought it was a good idea, and I read about it, and so what I did, they asked me, they took the sort of poll of what the members would like in the way of different activities, and one of them, of course, would be something to do with literature and all. And so I decided that what I would like to do would be to just have a group that comes and reads poetry. I didn't want to teach writing anymore. I'd done a lot of teaching along the way as well. And so that's been going on for almost 10 years now, and it's I think it's that long. Is it that long? Let's see, Norman has been sick for 5, so it probably is. So they meet at my house once a month, and I choose a poet or we've talked about different poets, and we just read the poetry and talk about it. And that's been just really a great thing to do during all of this kind of period. And now I'm working with a friend on an anthology of other poets' poetry about old age and that sort of thing.
Do you have a favorite poet?
I have many favorite poets. I mean, I just, but you know, the first person that would come to mind would be Emily Dickinson. Yeah.
Spoken like a true New Englander. So, on a totally different subject, what inventions have changed your life?
Inventions?
You've lived to see a lot of changes.
I have.
A
A beautiful place, and what's been done to it is so sad, and if we could, I'm just pontificating, but that the world is so beautiful. Each morning when I wake up and I see that sunrise, and I think, you know, where have I been all my life? It's been there every single morning, and I haven't even bothered to look at it most of the time. And it's more beautiful than anything in any museum, and grateful for my friends who've sort of rallied around me with Norm's sickness and death, my kids, and I don't know, it's just all a great big mystery. And we're not going to solve it probably, so just enjoy the ride.
Thank you very much, Marianne Hoberman, for being part of the story and for telling us your truth.
Thank you.